There are cities that dance, cities that sing, cities where music flows through the streets like water, where rhythm is as essential as breath. New Orleans is such a city. In 1918, as the world burned with war, as the Spanish flu swept across nations, killing millions, New Orleans tried to maintain its spirit, its music, its life. And then, in the dark hours before dawn, someone began breaking into homes. Not to steal, not to rob, but to kill with an axe. Between May 1918 and October 1919, this unknown assailant, this creature who called himself invisible, who claimed to be a demon from hell, attacked at least 12 people in their beds. 6 died. 6 more survived with shattered skulls and shattered memories. He wrote letters to the newspapers, theatrical, mocking letters. He claimed to be supernatural. He demanded that the city play jazz music to appease him. And on one strange night in March 1919, the entire city complied. Every dance hall packed, every home with a phonograph playing records, the sound of jazz filling the humid Louisiana air as people waited in terror for midnight to pass. The Axeman of New Orleans was never caught, never identified. He simply stopped as mysteriously as he began. This is his story. This is the terror that gripped a city. This is America's answer to Jack the Ripper. Sleep if you can. Part 1. The Crescent City. Before we meet the Axeman, we need to understand New Orleans in 1918. Picture a city unlike any other in America. A city where French, Spanish, African, Caribbean, and American cultures had blended over centuries into something entirely unique. New Orleans, the Crescent City, so called because it curves along a bend in the Mississippi River, the Big Easy, the birthplace of jazz. In 1918, the city was at a crossroads. The old ways, the Creole aristocracy, the antebellum traditions were fading. The new ways, industry, immigration, modern America were taking hold. The population was incredibly diverse. There were the old French and Spanish Creole families. There were African Americans, descendants of enslaved people and free people of color. There were Irish immigrants, German immigrants, and crucially for our story, Italian immigrants. The Italian community in New Orleans was substantial. Tens of thousands of Italians and Sicilians had arrived between 1880 and 1910, fleeing poverty in southern Italy. They settled primarily in the French Quarter and in neighborhoods like the lower Ninth Ward. Many opened small businesses, corner grocery stores, what New Orleanians called mom-and-pop stores. These weren't supermarkets. They were tiny shops, often just a room at the front of a house, where the family lived in the back and upstairs. They sold basics, bread, milk, vegetables, canned goods. They extended credit to neighbors. They were community institutions. But the Italian community faced significant prejudice. Anti-Italian sentiment was strong in early 20th century America. Italians were seen as foreign, as Catholic in a predominantly Protestant nation, as potentially involved in organized crime. In 1891, one of the largest mass lynchings in American history had occurred in New Orleans. 11 Italian immigrants were murdered by a mob after being acquitted of killing the city's police chief. The wounds from that event still lingered in 1918. Into this complex social landscape add two catastrophes. World War I had been raging since 1914. In April 1917, the United States entered the war. By 1918, young men from New Orleans were fighting in France. The city lived with constant anxiety about casualties, about loved ones who might not return. The Spanish flu pandemic hit New Orleans in fall 1918. Thousands fell ill, hundreds died. The city was overwhelmed, hospitals filled, morgues couldn't handle the bodies. People wore gauze masks. Public gatherings were restricted. So in May 1918, New Orleans was a city under stress. War, disease, economic hardship, social tension. And into this landscape of fear came something new to fear. A killer who struck at night, who entered locked homes through impossible means, who attacked people in their beds, who left behind nothing but blood and terror. Part 2. The first attack. May 23, 1918, early morning, Thursday. Andrew Maggio had been celebrating. He'd just been accepted into the Navy. In a few weeks he'd ship out, join the war effort, serve his country. He'd spent the evening drinking in the bars of the French Quarter. By the time he stumbled home to his apartment on Magnolia Street, near the corner of Upper Line, it was late, past midnight, approaching dawn. His apartment was adjacent to another unit in the same building. In that unit lived his older brother Joseph Maggio, aged 41, and Joseph's wife Catherine, aged 32. Joseph and Catherine owned a small grocery store on the ground floor of the building. They lived in the apartment above and next to it. It was a typical arrangement for Italian grocers. Work and home in the same building, always available to customers, living modestly. Andrew Maggio lived alone in the unit next door. The two apartments shared a wall. As Andrew prepared for bed, drunk and exhausted, he heard something. A groan, low, agonized, coming from next door. He paused, listening. Heard it again. Concerned, he left his apartment and knocked on Joseph and Catherine's door. No answer. He tried the door. It opened, unlocked, which was odd. Andrew entered and immediately saw blood, trails of it, leading from the door toward the bedroom. He ran to the bedroom and found a scene of horror. Joseph and Catherine Maggio lay in bed. The sheets were soaked with blood. The walls were spattered. Even the ceiling had droplets. Catherine was dead. Her throat had been cut so deeply that her head was nearly severed from her body. Joseph was alive, barely. His throat had also been cut, though not as severely. His head showed signs of blunt force trauma. He'd been struck with something heavy. He was making the groaning sounds Andrew had heard. He was trying to speak, trying to say something, but his severed windpipe made it impossible. Andrew screamed for help. His other brothers, Jake and Andrew, yes, two brothers named Andrew, sources are confusing on this point, lived nearby. They came running. Within minutes, police arrived. Joseph Maggio died before he could say a word. The injury to his throat prevented him from identifying his attacker. The police examined the scene. The Magios' bedroom was a slaughterhouse, blood everywhere. The attack had been frenzied, brutal, but certain details were immediately puzzling. The razor. Catherine's throat had been cut with a straight razor, Joseph's as well. The razor was found at the scene. It belonged to Andrew Maggio, who worked as a barber. How had the killer obtained Andrew's razor? The axe. Both victims had also been struck in the head with an axe. The axe was found near the bed. It belonged to the Magios. They kept it for chopping wood and other household tasks. The entry point. The back door of the apartment showed signs of forced entry. A panel had been removed, chiseled out cleanly. Someone had reached through the gap, unlocked the door from inside and entered. Nothing stolen. Money was visible in the apartment. Valuables were untouched. This wasn't a robbery. The clothes. A set of bloody clothes was found neatly folded in the bathroom. The killer had apparently cleaned up and changed before leaving. And then there was the message. On the sidewalk outside, written in chalk, were the words, "Mrs. Maggio will sit up tonight just like Mrs. Tony." What did that mean? Mrs. Tony, or Mrs. Tony, referred to Anna Sciambra. Her husband's name was Tony Sciambra. They'd been Italian grocers, and in 1912 someone had broken into their home and shot them. Anna had died. Tony had survived. The case had never been solved. Was the same person responsible? Was this a reference to that earlier crime? The police didn't know. Andrew Maggio, because he'd discovered the bodies and because his razor had been used, immediately became a suspect. He was questioned intensively, but his alibi checked out. Multiple people had seen him drinking at bars until late. He'd been too drunk to have committed such a calculated murder. He was released. The police had no other suspects, no witnesses, no clear motive. They ruled it an isolated incident, a personal grudge, perhaps something to do with the Magios' business. But they were wrong. This wasn't an isolated incident. This was just the beginning. Part 3. The pattern emerges. June 27, 1918, just over a month after the Maggio murders. A man named Louis Bissumer lived at 2123 Dorgenois Street with a woman named Anna Harriet Lowe, though she went by Harriet. The exact nature of their relationship was unclear. Bissumer, aged 59, claimed Lowe was his wife, but no marriage record existed. Lowe sometimes said she was his wife, sometimes his housekeeper, sometimes his common-law spouse. Bissumer ran a small grocery out of the front of the building. In the early morning hours of June 27th, Bissumer was woken by something. A sound. Movement. He sat up in bed and saw a figure in the doorway. A large man, shadowy in the darkness, wielding an axe. The axe came down. Bissumer raised his arms to protect himself. The blade caught him in the head. He fell. The attacker turned to Lowe and struck her as well, multiple times. Her skull fractured, and then the attacker fled. Neighbors, hearing screams, called police. Bissumer and Lowe were found alive but severely injured. Both were rushed to Charity Hospital. The police examined the scene. The same pattern, a back door panel chiseled away, an axe belonging to the victims used in the attack. No robbery. Bissumer survived, but his head injuries caused memory loss and confusion. He couldn't clearly describe the attacker. Lowe survived as well, but her injuries were more severe. She underwent surgery, and in her delirium she began making strange statements. She claimed Basuma was a German spy, that he'd attacked her, that he was involved in espionage. This was 1918. World War I paranoia was at its peak. Anything German was suspect. The police searched Basuma's house and found letters written in German and other foreign languages. They arrested him on suspicion of espionage. He was released 2 days later when the letters were determined to be innocuous business correspondence. But Lowe continued to accuse him. As her condition worsened, she insisted Basuma had tried to kill her. In August, Lowe's condition deteriorated after failed surgery. On her deathbed, she again named Basuma as her assailant. Based on this, Basuma was arrested and charged with murder. He would spend 9 months in jail before being acquitted. The jury deliberated for 10 minutes before finding him not guilty, because by then it was clear Basuma wasn't the Axeman. He was a victim. August 5, 1918. Anna Schneider, aged 28 and 8 months pregnant, was asleep in her bed when she felt a presence. She opened her eyes and saw a dark figure standing over her. Before she could scream, something struck her in the face. Again and again, her scalp split open. Blood poured down her face. She lost consciousness. When she came to, she was alone. The attacker had fled. Her husband Edward found her covered in blood. She was rushed to the hospital. Anna survived. She would later give birth to a healthy baby, but she had no memory of the attack beyond the initial moment of seeing a figure and then being struck. The police investigated. The same pattern. Forced entry through a door panel. An axe-like weapon used, though in this case it might have been a lamp base. Nothing stolen. Edward Schneider fell under suspicion. Spouses always do. But his alibi was solid. He'd been at work. Multiple witnesses confirmed it. The police had no other leads. August 10th, 1918. Joseph Romano, aged elderly. Sources vary on his exact age, but he was in his late 60s or 70s. Lived with his 2 nieces in a house on Tonti Street. The nieces slept in one room. Romano slept in another. In the early morning, the nieces heard a sound, a thud, a cry. They ran to their uncle's room and found him bleeding from a massive head wound. His skull had been fractured, and they saw the attacker. Fleeing through a door, a man, dark-skinned or dark-clothed, the nieces weren't sure, heavy-set, wearing a dark suit and a slouched hat. It was the clearest description anyone had given yet, but it wasn't clear enough. Romano died 2 days later from his injuries. The police investigated. The same pattern. Door panel removed, an axe used, nothing stolen. And now panic began to set in. This wasn't isolated incidents. This was a pattern, a serial attacker. Someone was breaking into homes at night. Someone was attacking people with axes. Someone who seemed to target Italian immigrants. The newspapers began calling him the Axeman, and Orleans began to live in fear. Part 4. The Terror. By late summer 1918, the people of New Orleans were terrified. The newspapers reported every attack in lurid detail. Speculation ran wild. Who was the Axeman? Why was he targeting Italians? How was he entering locked homes? The Italian community was especially frightened. Many families were grocers, living above or adjacent to their stores, exactly the pattern the Axeman seemed to prefer. People began taking precautions. Families took shifts, staying awake at night, armed with shotguns or other weapons, watching for any sign of an intruder. Hardware stores sold out of chisels and door locks. People reinforced their doors, checked their windows obsessively. Some families moved in together, believing safety in numbers. Italian grocers began sleeping with loaded firearms next to their beds. The police were overwhelmed. They received hundreds of reports. I saw the Axeman lurking in my neighborhood. I found an axe in my backyard that wasn't there before. My door has tool marks. He tried to break in. Most of these reports led nowhere. People were seeing threats everywhere. The panic was feeding on itself. Superintendent of Police Frank Mooney made public statements trying to calm the city. He insisted the police were following every lead. He increased patrols in Italian neighborhoods. But privately, the police had almost nothing. No witnesses who could give a useful description. No physical evidence that pointed to anyone. No clear motive beyond apparent anti-Italian prejudice. Former Detective John D'Antonio, a retired Italian investigator who had become a national expert on organized crime, offered his opinion. He didn't believe this was mafia-related. The Black Hand, as Italian organized crime was often called, would have been more professional, would have left fewer survivors, would have had clear motives. Instead, D'Antonio suggested something more disturbing. A serial killer, a degenerate in the language of the time, a person with what we'd now call a compulsion to kill. He compared the Axeman to Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, a person who might seem normal during the day but who was overcome by murderous urges at night. This didn't reassure anyone. And then, for a while, the attacks stopped. After Joseph Romano's murder in August, there were no more confirmed Axeman attacks for months. September passed. October, November, December, January, February. 7 months of silence. People began to wonder, was it over? Had the Axeman died, been arrested for something else, left the city? Or was he just waiting? The answer came in March 1919. Part 5. The Cortimiglia Tragedy. March 10th, 1919. Gretna, Louisiana, a town just across the Mississippi River from New Orleans. Charles Cortimiglia, his wife Rosie, and their 2-year-old daughter Mary lived in a small house. Charles, like so many victims before him, was an Italian immigrant and grocer. In the early morning hours, around 3 a.m., the Axeman struck again. The attack was brutal. Charles was struck in the head with an axe. Rosie was struck multiple times. Both were left with fractured skulls and severe injuries. And little Mary, 2 years old, was killed, her skull crushed. A neighbor, Orlando Giordano, heard screaming. He ran to the Cortimiglia house and found the horrific scene. Charles and Rosie were still alive, covered in blood. Mary was dead in her mother's arms. Police arrived. The same pattern. Door panel removed, axe used, this time the family's own, nothing stolen. But this case would take a bizarre turn. Charles and Rosie were taken to the hospital. Both survived, though their injuries were severe. And when police questioned Rosie, she made a shocking accusation. She blamed the Giordanos, Orlando Giordano and his son Frank. She claimed they had attacked her family. Why? The Giordanos were neighbors. They were also Italian grocers, business competitors. There had been a dispute between the families over business matters. The Giordanos had recently sued the Cortimiglias. Rosie insisted the Giordanos were responsible, despite the fact that the attack matched the Axeman's pattern exactly, despite the lack of any evidence connecting the Giordanos to previous attacks. The Gretna police, apparently unable or unwilling to believe in a serial killer, arrested both Giordanos. Orlando Giordano was elderly, around 70 years old. His son Frank was 17. Neither had any history of violence. Charles Cortimiglia, recovering from his injuries, contradicted his wife. He insisted the Giordanos were innocent. He said he hadn't seen the attacker clearly, but it wasn't the Giordanos. But Rosie wouldn't recant. She testified against them at trial. In May 1919, both Giordanos were convicted. Orlando was sentenced to hang. Frank received a life sentence. It was a miscarriage of justice driven by prejudice, panic, and a desire to believe the Axeman could be caught. But the attacks continued, proving the Giordanos were innocent. Part 6. The Letter. March 13, 1919. 3 days after the Cortimiglia attack. The Times-Picayune, New Orleans major newspaper, received a letter. It was written in a theatrical, dramatic style. The handwriting was neat, almost calligraphic. It was dated simply Hell, and it was signed the Axeman. The letter read, "Esteemed mortal, they have never caught me and they never will. They have never seen me, for I am invisible, even as the ether that surrounds your earth. I am not a human being, but a spirit and a demon from the hottest hell. I am what you Orleanians and your foolish police call the Axeman. When I see fit, I shall come and claim other victims. I alone know whom they shall be. I shall leave no clue except my bloody axe, besmeared with blood and brains of he whom I have sent below to keep me company. If you wish, you may tell the police to be careful not to rile me. Of course, I am a reasonable spirit. I take no offense at the way they have conducted their investigations in the past. In fact, they have been so utterly stupid as to not only amuse me, but His Satanic Majesty Francis Joseph, etc. But tell them to beware. Let them not try to discover what I am, for it were better that they were never born than to incur the wrath of the Axeman. I don't think there is any need of such a warning, for I feel sure the police will always dodge me, as they have in the past. They are wise and know how to keep away from all harm. Undoubtedly, you Orleanians think of me as a most horrible murderer, which I am, but I could be much much worse if I wanted to. If I wished, I could pay a visit to your city every night. At will I could slay thousands of your best citizens, for I am in close relationship with the angel of death. Now, to be exact, at 12:15 earthly time on next Tuesday night, I am going to pass over New Orleans. In my infinite mercy, I am going to make a little proposition to you people. Here it is. I am very fond of jazz music, and I swear by all the devils in the nether regions that every person shall be spared in whose home a jazz band is in full swing at the time I have just mentioned. If everyone has a jazz band going, well then, so much the better for you people. One thing is certain, and that is that some of your people who do not jazz it on Tuesday night, if there be any, will get the axe. Well, as I am cold and crave the warmth of my native Tartarus, and it is about time I leave your earthly home, I will cease my discourse, hoping that thou wilt publish this, and that it may go well with thee. I have been, am, and will be the worst spirit that ever existed, either in fact or realm of fancy. The Axeman. The newspaper published the letter, and New Orleans lost its collective mind. Was this real? Had the Axeman actually written this? Or was it a hoax? The theatrical language suggested someone educated. The references to mythology and literature indicated culture. This didn't sound like the brutal killer who'd been smashing skulls with axes. But real or not, people took it seriously, because the letter had made a specific threat. Tuesday night, March 19th at 12:15 a.m., the Axeman would strike, unless people were playing jazz. March 19th fell on St. Joseph's Day, a significant holiday in the Italian community, a religious feast day. Normally, it would be celebrated with church services, family gatherings, traditional foods. But in 1919, it would be celebrated with jazz. Part 7. The Jazz Night. Tuesday, March 18th, 1919 evening. All across New Orleans, people prepared. Every dance hall, every bar, every club with live music advertised jazz performances. Capacity crowds packed in. Some venues stayed open all night. People who owned phonographs, record players, made sure they had jazz records ready to play. Amateur musicians formed impromptu bands. Families gathered around pianos. The city's professional jazz musicians, this was still the early days of jazz, remember, the genre was barely 20 years old, had more work than they could handle. A local composer named Joseph John de Villa wrote a song specifically for the occasion, the mysterious Axeman's Jazz, Don't Scare Me, Papa. He finished it around 2 a.m. on Wednesday morning after the threat had passed. The sheet music cover showed a family frantically playing instruments while watching the door in terror. As midnight approached, the sound of jazz filled New Orleans. Every style, every tempo, traditional jazz, ragtime, blues-influenced numbers, professional performances, and amateur attempts. The whole city making noise, making music, desperately hoping it would be enough. 12:15 a.m. came and went. The music continued. People waited, listening for screams, watching for signs of attack. Nothing. The night passed without incident. No attacks, no violence. By morning, exhausted New Orleanians could breathe again. The Axeman had kept his word, or the letter had been a hoax, or the city's compliance had genuinely appeased whatever this creature was. We'll never know. But the event entered legend the night an entire city played jazz to appease a serial killer. And it worked, at least for that night. Part 8. The attacks continue. But the Axeman wasn't finished. August 10th, 1919. Steve Boca, an Italian grocer, was attacked in his home. He survived but couldn't remember details of the attack due to severe head injuries. September 3rd, 1919. Sarah Lauman, a 19-year-old woman, was attacked in her apartment. She survived but lost several teeth and had no memory of the incident. This attack was significant because Lauman wasn't Italian and didn't run a grocery. She was a young white American woman living alone. October 27th, 1919. Mike Pepitone. This would be the last. Mike Pepitone, aged 32, lived with his wife Esther and their 6 children. They ran a small grocery and lived in the building. The location was at South Scott and Ulloa Streets in Mid-City. That weekend, a circus was in town on nearby Tulane Avenue. The Pepitone's store had been busy selling soft drinks to circus goers. Mike and Esther had had a long day. They went to bed, exhausted. Around 1 a.m., Esther was awakened by a scream. Her husband's scream. She ran to his bedroom. They slept in separate rooms and saw a large man fleeing. He was holding an axe. Mike was in bed, covered in blood. His skull had been fractured in 3 places. Blood spattered the walls and ceiling. Even a picture of the Virgin Mary hanging above the bed was speckled with crimson. Esther later told police, "I sleep very heavily. I heard nothing until my husband screamed." Mike Pepitone died from his injuries. Esther could give almost no description of the attacker, just large, that was all. The usual pattern: door panel removed, nothing stolen, though in this case the weapon wasn't an axe but a heavy bolt or tent stake. The police investigated. They found $100 in cash in the kitchen, proceeds from the circus sales, untouched. And then, nothing. No more attacks. The Axeman, after 18 months of terror, simply stopped. Part 9. Theories. Who was the Axeman of New Orleans? Over a century later, we still don't know, but theories abound. Theory 1. A serial killer. This is the consensus view among modern criminologists. The Axeman was a serial killer, probably a white male in his 30s, working class, with experience in burglary, explaining his skill at breaking in. The targeting of Italian grocers might have been personal. He had a grudge against Italians for some reason. Practical. Italian grocers were predictable targets, living in known locations above their stores. Incidental. He attacked whoever was convenient, and many fit a certain profile. The sexual sadism angle. Some researchers, including criminologists Colin and Damon Wilson, suggest the Axeman specifically targeted women. In cases where men were killed, it was because they got in the way. This would explain why some male victims survived while female victims died. The Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde theory. Detective D'Antonio's suggestion that the Axeman might be a normal citizen by day who was overcome by murderous compulsions at night. This fits some serial killer patterns. Ted Bundy, the BTK killer, and others maintain normal lives while killing. Theory 2. The Mafia, Black Hand. Some contemporary observers believe the attacks were related to Italian organized crime. Evidence for this: the victims were predominantly Italian. There were documented Black Hand operations in New Orleans targeting Italian businesses for extortion. Mike Pepitone's family had been involved in a vendetta-related killing years earlier. Evidence against this: too many survivors. Organized crime hits are typically more efficient. No extortion demands were made. The theatrical letter doesn't fit mafia patterns. The randomness doesn't suggest professional hits. Theory 3. Multiple killers. Some researchers suggest not all attacks attributed to the Axeman were committed by the same person. Supporting this, some attacks, like the Schneider case, showed different patterns. Some victims weren't Italian grocers. The long gap between attacks in 1918 to 1919 might indicate different perpetrators. Against this, the core pattern was remarkably consistent. Door panel removed, axe from the home used, no robbery. Copycat killers are rare in crimes requiring this much planning. Theory 4. Joseph Mumfre. This is the most famous suspect theory, though also the most disputed. Joseph Mumfre, also spelled Monfre, Monfre, Manfre, or Mumphrey, record keeping was poor, was a career criminal in New Orleans. In 1907, he'd been convicted of bombing a grocery store as part of an extortion scheme. The theory gained traction because of what happened after Mike Pepitone's murder. Esther Pepitone, widowed with 6 children, moved to Los Angeles in January 1921. She remarried a man named Angelo Albano, someone she'd known from New Orleans. Angelo had previously been in business with Joseph Mumfre. On October 27, 1921, exactly 2 years after Mike Pepitone's murder, Angelo Albano mysteriously disappeared. On December 5, 1921, Joseph Mumfre showed up at Esther's Los Angeles home. According to her later testimony, he demanded $500 in jewelry. He said, "Give it to me or I'll kill you like I killed your husband." Esther shot him dead. When police arrived, she claimed Mumfre was the Axeman, that she'd seen him fleeing Mike's bedroom that night, that he'd killed Mike and probably Angelo too. Police investigated and found Mumfre had a long criminal record. He'd been involved in Black Hand activities. He'd targeted Italian grocers before, but problems with the theory. True crime writer Michael Newton researched extensively and found no solid documentation connecting Mumfre to the Axeman crimes. The timeline doesn't clearly match. Was Mumfre in jail during some of the attacks? Sources conflict. Esther's story seems convenient, a widow getting revenge. Mike Pepitone's murder might have been unrelated to the other Axeman crimes. It was a vendetta killing in a family with a history of such violence. Theory 5. Joseph Davila, the jazz musician. Historian Miriam Davis has proposed an intriguing alternate theory. The famous letter might not have been written by the Axeman at all. Joseph John Davila was a struggling jazz musician and composer. His career needed a boost. The Axeman letter appeared on March 13th. It demanded jazz be played on March 19th. Davila composed the mysterious Axeman's jazz and completed it by 2 a.m. on March 19th. He immediately began selling sheet music. It became a hit. Davis suggests Davila might have written the letter himself as a publicity stunt. The real Axeman never wrote anything. Davila capitalized on genuine terror to promote jazz and himself. This would explain the theatrical, educated tone of the letter, so different from the brutal attacks. Of course, this doesn't solve who the actual killer was, but it would mean the famous jazz connection was manufactured. Part 10. What happened to the Axeman? After October 27, 1919, the Axeman was never heard from again in New Orleans. The attacks simply stopped. Why? Possible explanations. He died. Natural causes, accident, victim of crime, Spanish flu, which was still claiming lives in late 1919. He was imprisoned for something else. Many serial killers are eventually caught for unrelated crimes. He moved. Some evidence suggests axe attacks on Italian grocers occurred in other Louisiana towns, Alexandria, DeRidder, Lake Charles. In 1920 to 1921, same pattern. Were these the Axeman or copycat crimes? He stopped. Some serial killers simply cease. BTK went dormant for decades. The Zodiac killer stopped. We don't know why. As for the victims and suspects, Rosie Cortimiglia eventually recanted her accusation against the Giordano's. In December 1920, she publicly admitted she'd lied. She'd been traumatized, grief-stricken over her daughter's death, and had falsely blamed the neighbors. The Giordano's were released. Orlando's death sentence was overturned. They were exonerated. Esther Pepitone was tried for killing Joseph Mumfre but was acquitted. The jury believed her claim of self-defense. She lived the rest of her life in Los Angeles, always maintaining that Mumfre was the Axeman. The Italian community slowly recovered. The fear faded, but the memory lingered. Even today, elderly Italian Americans in New Orleans remember their grandparents' stories of the Axeman. The police never solved the case. No arrests were made. No one was ever charged with being the Axeman. The case remains officially unsolved. Part 11. The Legacy. The Axeman of New Orleans left a strange legacy. In terms of body count, he was not one of history's most prolific serial killers. 6 confirmed deaths, 6 survivors. Terrible, yes, but smaller than many other cases. But the Axeman achieved something else. He terrorized an entire city. He became legend in jazz history. The famous letter, whether authentic or not, created an enduring connection between jazz and the supernatural. The image of an entire city playing jazz to ward off evil is irresistible. Jazz musicians still reference the Axeman. Songs have been written about him. The story is part of New Orleans jazz folklore. In true crime, the Axeman is studied as an early example of serial killer investigation in America. In 1918 to 1919, the concept of a serial killer didn't really exist in public consciousness. The term wouldn't be coined until the 1970s. But the Axeman exhibited classic serial killer patterns: repetitive attacks with a cooling-off period, a specific method, breaking in using victim's axe, target selection, though the exact reason remains unclear, possible escalation. The attacks became more frequent in 1919. Modern FBI profilers have analyzed the case. The Axeman would likely fit the organized killer profile. Methodical, planned attacks left few clues, probably had normal social functioning. In popular culture, the Axeman has appeared in numerous works. The TV show American Horror Story Coven, 2013 to 2014, featured a fictionalized Axeman as a major character. Multiple novels, including crime fiction and horror, jazz compositions and albums referencing the story, true crime podcasts and documentaries, ghost tour narratives in New Orleans. In New Orleans culture, the Axeman is part of the city's dark history, alongside other famous crimes and tragedies. Tour guides tell his story. Bars and restaurants sometimes reference him, but it's treated carefully. Unlike some colorful historical criminals, the Axeman's victims were real people with families who remember them. The Axeman's letter to the Times-Picayune is considered one of the most theatrical communications from a criminal in American history. It's compared to Jack the Ripper's From Hell letter and the Zodiac Killer's cryptograms. Whether it was genuine or a hoax, it captured something about New Orleans, a city where music, superstition, terror, and resilience could all coexist on one surreal night. Part 12. The Victims. Let's remember the people who died or were injured. Joseph and Catherine Maggio, the first victims. Joseph, 41, and Catherine, 32, Italian grocers. Their grocery store on Magnolia Street closed after their deaths. They left behind family members traumatized by the brutal murders. Harriet Lowe died August 1918 from injuries sustained in the June attack. She was about 28 years old. Her death was slow, 2 months of suffering before the end. Her delirious accusations of Louis Bassumer nearly led to an innocent man being executed. Joseph Romano, elderly grocer on Tonti Street, died August 12, 1918, 2 days after the attack. He lived with his nieces, who witnessed the attack but couldn't stop it. Mary Cortimiglia, 2 years old, the youngest and most heartbreaking victim, killed March 10, 1919 in Gretna. Her death traumatized her parents so severely that Rosie made false accusations that nearly led to 2 innocent men being executed. Mike Pepitone, the last confirmed victim, aged 32, father of 6 children, died October 27, 1919. His widow Esther claimed to have identified the killer 2 years later, but will never know if she was right. Survivors. Louis Bassumer survived but spent 9 months in jail, wrongly accused of being the Axeman and of murdering Harriet Lowe. He was acquitted, but his life was destroyed. Anna Schneider survived while 8 months pregnant. She gave birth to a healthy baby despite her skull fractures. Charles and Rosie Cortimiglia survived physically, but were destroyed emotionally. Their daughter's death, Rosie's false accusations, and the guilt afterward. Their marriage didn't survive. They divorced in 1920. Steve Boker survived but had permanent memory loss from his head injuries. Sarah Lohman survived but lost teeth and carried facial scars. These weren't just statistics. These were real people whose lives were shattered by a killer who was never brought to justice. Part 13. The Unanswered Questions. Over a century later, fundamental questions remain. Who was the Axeman? We don't know. Despite theories, despite Esther Pepitone's claims about Joseph Mumfre, we have no definitive answer. Joseph Mumfre might have killed Mike Pepitone, a vendetta killing, but the evidence connecting him to the other attacks is circumstantial at best. The real Axeman, the person who committed most of the attacks, was probably never caught. He died or moved or stopped and took his identity to the grave. Why did he target Italian grocers? Theories. Personal grudge against Italians. Practical. They were easy to find and predict. Sexual motivation. Targeting women with men as collateral. Random. He attacked whoever was convenient, and many happened to fit a pattern. We don't know. How did he enter locked homes? The panel removal method was consistent and skilled. He used a chisel to remove door panels cleanly, reach through to unlock the door from inside. This suggests someone with burglary experience, someone with carpentry skills, someone methodical and patient, someone who understood building construction. Why did the attack stop? This is perhaps the most puzzling question. After October 1919, no more confirmed Axeman attacks in New Orleans. Did he die? Was he imprisoned? Did he leave the city? Some researchers point to possible attacks in other Louisiana towns in 1920 to 1921, suggesting he moved. But these are poorly documented and might be unrelated. Did he write the letter? The March 13, 1919 letter is the most famous aspect of the case. But did the actual killer write it? Arguments. It was genuine. It demonstrated knowledge of the attacks. The timing after a brutal attack fits serial killer patterns of communication. The demand for jazz on a specific date showed confidence. Arguments. It was a hoax. The theatrical, educated language doesn't match the brutal violence. No other communications from the Axeman exist. Joseph Davila, the jazz musician, benefited enormously. It could have been written by a journalist for publicity. We'll never know for certain. The original letter, if it still exists, has never been subjected to forensic analysis that could provide clues. What happened to Angelo Albano? Esther Pepitone's second husband disappeared mysteriously in October 1921, just before she killed Joseph Mumfre. Was Mumfre responsible? Was this connected to the Axeman crimes, or was it a separate vendetta matter in a community where such violence was not uncommon? No investigation into Angelo's disappearance ever conclusively determined what happened to him. Were all the attacks by the same person? The core attacks, Maggio, Romano, Cortimiglia, Pepitone, show remarkable consistency. But some attributed attacks, Schneider-Laumann, show variations. It's possible that all attacks were by one person who varied his method slightly. A core set of attacks were by the Axeman, while others were copycat crimes or unrelated. More than one person was involved, working together or separately. Part 14. The City That Jazz Saved. There's something fundamentally New Orleans about the Axeman story. Only in New Orleans, a city steeped in music, superstition, voodoo folklore, Catholic mysticism, and Creole traditions, would people respond to a serial killer by playing jazz. Only in New Orleans would a letter claiming to be from a demon be taken seriously enough that the entire city participated in a mass ritual of music. The Jazz Night of March 19, 1919, reveals something about the city's character. In the face of terror, New Orleans chose to make music, to gather, to celebrate life even while fearing death. This wasn't unique to the Axeman crisis. It's how New Orleans has always responded to tragedy. After Hurricane Katrina, when the city was devastated, what brought people back? What rebuilt the spirit of New Orleans? Music, jazz funerals, second lines, Mardi Gras returning, the brass bands playing in the streets, the clubs reopening, the musicians refusing to let their city die. The Axeman threatened the city with death. The city responded with life, with rhythm, with defiant joy. And whether the letter was genuine or fake, whether the Axeman was appeased or simply paused, the city survived. New Orleans has always been a city that dances in the face of death. The jazz funerals, mourning with music, celebrating the dead with parades, are the ultimate expression of this philosophy. The Axeman, whether he knew it or not, challenged the very soul of New Orleans, and New Orleans answered with its most powerful weapon, music. Part 15. Epilogue. The demon who loved jazz. The jazz still plays in New Orleans. Every night, in clubs and bars and street corners, the music flows. The sound that was born here over a century ago, that grew from the mingling of African rhythms and European harmony and Caribbean melodies and American blues. The sound that, for one strange night in 1919, became a shield against evil. On March 19, 1919, New Orleans played jazz to survive. The entire city, tens of thousands of people, made music because a killer demanded it. And the killer kept his word, or he didn't exist, or he was listening somewhere in the darkness, pleased by the tribute. We'll never know. What we know is this. Between May 1918 and October 1919, someone terrorized New Orleans. Someone who broke into homes with impossible skill. Someone who killed with brutal efficiency. Someone who wrote letters claiming to be a demon. 6 people died. 6 more were permanently scarred. An entire city lived in fear. And then it stopped. The killer, whoever he was, whatever he was, vanished, left no trace, became legend. Joseph Mumfre might have been the Axeman, or he might have just been a criminal who Esther Pepitone killed for other reasons, conveniently blamed for the murders. The real Axeman might have died in 1919 or 1920, might have been arrested for something else, might have moved to another city and killed under different methods, or might have simply stopped, satisfied his compulsion, retired from murder the way some people retire from any profession. We'll never know. All we have are the facts, the attacks, the survivors, the victims, the letter, the jazz night, the unanswered questions, and the music. The music that filled New Orleans that March night, that fills it still. The rhythm that defied death. The sound that said, "We will not be silenced by fear." The Axeman of New Orleans tried to make a city cower. Instead, he made it dance. And in the end, which force was stronger? The one who killed in darkness, who struck from shadows, who fled before dawn, or the one that played in the light, that gathered communities, that celebrated life even in the face of death? New Orleans knows the answer. The music plays on, every night, every street, every club, and somewhere perhaps a demon listens, or a ghost, or just a memory of evil that once walked these streets. The jazz plays for the living, but maybe, just maybe, it also plays for the dead, for the victims who never heard music again, for the city that refused to let fear win, for the mystery that will never be solved. This is the story of the Axeman of New Orleans. This is America's answer to Jack the Ripper. This is the serial killer who demanded jazz. This is what happens when terror meets a city that knows how to dance in the dark. Sleep if you can, but if you hear music in the night, maybe that's a good thing. Maybe that's what keeps the demons away.